Yeah, so today we have John Zaratsky here, who is a design partner at Google Ventures, and he's going to be talking about their sprint methodology. So, with that being said, I will hand this over to John, and we can go ahead and get this going.
All right. Hi, everybody. Jerry, do you want me to share my video or just my screen?
You could do both, actually.
Okay.
You could start by sharing the screen, and you can go ahead and share the video as well. So let me quickly modify a few settings here, but screen should be shown. Yep.
All right. Can you see my screen?
Yep. And guys, I'll drop a link in Amazon to where you guys can get this book. We have this book, and it's pretty good. We have a bookshelf in our office, and yeah, it's a useful methodology.
Should I turn on my video as well?
Yeah. Can you turn it on?
It says the host has stopped it.
Let me fix that real quick for you. And there we go. You should be all set now.
Still getting the same message about the video.
Well, let's just go ahead and start then.
All right. Cool. All right. Sorry for the technical difficulties, everybody, and thank you very much for taking some time to join me today. As Jerry said, I'm John Zaratsky. I'm a design partner at GV, and I wrote this book along with Jake Knapp and Braden Coates. I will definitely tell you all about the design sprint process that we have developed at GV, and I'm going to tell you some stories about some sprints that we've been involved in, including one with Slack where we helped them reach an audience for their product that was 10 times larger than what they had done before. But before I can do any of that, I've got to take you back in time, back to the turn of the century when everything looked a little bit sepia toned, a little bit like this. Back to the year 2002, maybe not the century you were thinking of. But in 2002, I got my very first job as a designer, and I was a designer at a newspaper. This is sort of what newspapers used to look like. Just kidding. In all seriousness, this is the newspaper that I worked at as a designer. And you might not think of a newspaper as being designed, but it really is. For each issue of the paper, we'd have a bunch of stories from our reporters. We would have some photographs that our photographers had taken, and we'd have a list of priorities. Essentially, we would have from our editors, they'd say, these we think are the top stories today. These are less important. If you have room for these, try to fit them in. And every day we'd have to sort of put this puzzle together for each issue of the newspaper. And the process we followed looked a little bit like this. We'd start with our goals, which were that list of priorities from the editors. We'd each have our own ideas about how we could lay out the pages of the paper to make it all fit. We'd argue, of course, about which ideas were best, who had the best idea for how to lay out the paper. Then we'd build it. We'd put together the layout for the paper in Quark Express, which is a page layout tool. Then we'd ship the paper, literally. We would upload a PDF file to an FTP server at our printing company, and then they would print the paper, and they would put it into trucks, and they would drive it all around town and drop it off at the different distribution points where you could get the paper. And then we test the paper, and this is kind of a weird one. I was surprised when I learned about this myself, because it seems like a newspaper would be hard to test. Well, one of the places that this newspaper was distributed was on the campus of the University of Wisconsin. And I was a student at the time at University of Wisconsin. And so I would go to class, and while I was waiting for class to start, this was before the iPhone and even before Facebook. So, as I was sitting and waiting for class to start, people would read the paper. That's what you would do while you're waiting for class to start. And so I would sort of sit there and I would look, and I'd, hopefully I wasn't too creepy about it, but I would try to watch how people read the paper. to sort of see what parts of the design were working, which sections were they paying attention to, where were they lingering longer, where were they skipping. Shocker, they really like reading sports and comic strips. But, all kidding aside, I sort of lucked my way into this really special opportunity to see people using my design work immediately after I had done it. And then I could learn, and I could fix my mistakes, and I could do things better the next time. So this was the design process that we went through the newspaper, and we did it every day. This was a daily newspaper. So this whole process took place for me from about 4 p.m. to midnight every day. This was a one-day design process. After a few years, in a moment of rare wisdom, I decided that maybe newspaper design wasn't the best career path for the 21st century. So I decided to teach myself web design. And I got a job at a startup in Chicago called FeedBurner. And I was really excited about FeedBurner because, among other reasons, the team was really experienced. It was a team of 4 entrepreneurs who had started several companies together. Our CEO was Dick Costolo, who went on to become the CEO of Twitter. So very experienced, very smart team. And I couldn't wait to see what their design process was like. And I found that it was basically the same process that we used at the newspaper. Except instead of taking one day, it took us about 3 months to get through that design process. Some of this was because of the complexity of what we were doing. At FeedBurner, we created a software platform that hosted and distributed content for web publishers. So, it was complicated and it was sort of mission critical. But that wasn't the only reason it took longer. For the first time at FeedBurner, I started to see some of the common problems that can come up that can slow us down and sort of come between us and our work. I saw how talking about goals can often be tricky. A lot of times at FeedBurner, we wouldn't really talk about the goals at all. The CEO might say, hey, we want to launch this feature. So I'd go off and try to design it, but we didn't actually talk about why we wanted to launch that feature. We'd waste a lot of time arguing. We would talk in abstract about which approach we thought was best, or what we thought our customers would do, or where they would click, or how they would use something. But we didn't really do much sort of prototyping and testing to try to figure that out. And then we spent a lot of time shipping. We wanted to get everything right before we got it out in the world. We wanted to make sure that it was perfect. And frankly, we wasted a lot of time waiting to put things out in the world. In 2007, we were acquired by Google. So I then found myself as a UX designer at Google. And I started working on some pretty big, important projects. I worked on some of Google's advertising tools. Just to give you a sense of the magnitude, we at the time, the products that I was working on were responsible for managing 60% of Google's revenue. So really, important enterprise projects. And then I had a chance to work on YouTube. And it was another huge project because YouTube at the time was not quite the number 1 website in the world, but number 2 behind Google. I think Facebook's up there somewhere now. But the project I worked on was redesigning YouTube. This is what it looked like before I got there, and this is what it looked like when I left. So, maybe not a huge visual change on the homepage at least, but there were a lot of changes behind the scenes. The row of channels down the left-hand side of the screen was something new, and the idea of using channels to organize the whole site was something new. But this was a big project, very tough to get right, very, very long design process. And because of all that, it took us a year. So we were kind of following the same fundamental steps that I had seen at FeedBurner and I had seen at the newspaper, but now it's taking us a year to get through this design process. So I had seen in my career a progression from a one-day design process to 3 months to a year. And it kind of left me wondering, now what? What's next? Is the next project I work on going to take 5 years to get through that design process? That didn't sit right with me. I was particularly worried about not having as many opportunities to get to that testing part of the process. I had learned so much from that, watching people read the newspaper, that I had learned to value it very early in my career. But I was worried that I wasn't getting nearly as many opportunities in these longer design cycles. So in 2011, as I was asking myself this question, I had a chance to join GV, which at the time was called Google Ventures, before Alphabet took the rest of our letters. At GV, we invest in startups. So my job was and still is to work with the startups we've invested in to help them become successful companies. And at first, I would say that I had an expert's mindset. That was sort of my approach to doing the job. I said, I've been a designer for a while. I've had some success. I know what I'm doing. So I'll just go to these startups that GV invested in, and I'll just kind of tell them what to do, right? So that was sort of my approach. I'll tell you what to do because I'm an expert. But of course, this approach only works if I actually know what to do. And at first, that was kind of the case. I joined Braden and Michael at GV, and we had a relatively small portfolio of companies, but it kept growing and growing. And what started out with things that we actually were experts in, like apps and e-commerce and healthcare, started to expand into even more industries like robotics and even coffee. I love coffee, and I love making coffee and thinking about coffee and talking about coffee, but I'm not an expert in coffee. So things were starting to get a little bit tricky in this job and using this expert's mindset. So we realized that approach wasn't going to work. We realized that we couldn't depend on ourselves to have all the answers. Instead, we needed a system to help our companies find the answers with our help. And that's when I met Jake Knapp. So a few things you need to know about Jake Knapp. He was a designer at Google. And number two, he's very tall. And I know this doesn't seem like it's important, and it's not important, but it's just so remarkable. I just have to share this picture with you. This is a picture of me next to Jake. Just for, you guys, you can't see me obviously, but I'm 6'3", but I look like a shrimp next to Jake in this picture. So anyway, just, that was too good to not share. But most importantly, Jake was doing something that he called a design sprint. It's a process that he had created at Google. And the essence of the design sprint was to build and test a prototype with customers, and to do it in 5 days. And so when I learned about this, I got really excited because I had been through this process in my career where I had seen the design process get slower and slower and slower. And now here was a way to get through the entire design process in just 5 days. So we brought Jake to our team, and we started to run design sprints with all the companies in the GV portfolio. And we tweaked the process and refined it, and we made changes and we optimized it. And we got it down to a point where, it worked well in a repeated way. Pretty much any team could pick up the process and use it. And there were a few important changes from the process that I had seen previously in my career that enabled us to do the design sprint in 5 days. The first was that instead of talking about goals, we would actually map out the customer problem. Instead of brainstorming ideas, we would actually have each person in the sprint sketch their own ideas for solutions that we could build. Instead of arguing over what we should do in the abstract, we would use a series of structured decision-making exercises to actually decide which ideas were best. And instead of building and shipping, we would build a realistic prototype that we could put in front of customers. And instead of testing, just kidding, we would still test. In fact, the test is probably the most important part of the entire design sprint, as you'll see. And because of these changes, and because we were able to be efficient with our time and to clear everybody's calendar and to focus on this, very important project, sort of one thing at a time, we're able to get through the design sprint process in just 5 days. These 5 days, they map very nicely and conveniently to the days of the week. And so next I want to zoom in and tell you what happens on each day of a design sprint. So we start the week by gathering the real team, not a special creative team who's going to do this special creative project, but the real team. And we put them in a room with no distractions. So that means no smartphones, no laptops, no tablets, and no other meetings. So from 10 to 5 each day during the sprint, no other meetings. Everybody's 100% focused on the project that we're working on in the sprint. We write down the long-term goal, which is where the team wants to be in 12 to 18 months, and then a series of questions that might trip them up along the way, questions we can try to answer in the sprint. We make a map of the customer's experience, basically a diagram showing how the customer is going to interact with that product or the company. And we can't solve all this stuff in a sprint, but when we have the map, we can select a target. This is the area of the greatest risk or greatest opportunity that we know we want to focus our energy on for the rest of the sprint. On Tuesday, it's time to come up with ideas for how we might reach this goal, but we don't do any group brainstorming in a sprint. Instead, we have each individual person work on their own quietly to sketch their ideas. We want people to take their ideas out of their heads where they're in abstract form, and of course they're perfect and they're brilliant and they're beautiful, and turn them into concrete sketches, actual sketches that represent those ideas in sort of real life, so that we can all look at them and evaluate them. This is kind of what the sketches look like. They're super detailed, but they're not works of art. They're mostly just words and boxes on paper. This one's actually a little bit fancier than average because it has a drawing of a kettle. But most sketches don't even have a drawing of a kettle. They're just like rectangles and words. These are sketches that anybody can do. We've had everybody from CEOs to engineers to customer service people in our sprints making sketches. In a typical sprint, we'll have 10 or more competing solutions from these sketches, and we can't prototype them all, so we have to narrow it down. And that's exactly what we do on Wednesday. If you've ever tried to make a decision as a team, as a group, you've probably run into some of these problems. It's really hard to make a good decision as a team. You might be subject to sales pitches from somebody who's the loudest voice in the room. You might get stuck in endless debate or end up with a decision that everybody agrees on, but nobody's super happy about. So in a sprint, we clear away all these problems and we use a series of structured decision-making exercises. We start with voting silently, so everybody can sort of choose the things that they think are the most promising ideas. Then we do a speed critique. It's fast, although it's not quite this fast. I think this video is sped up just a little bit. But this is a chance for everybody to talk about the ideas, to talk about the parts that they like, the parts that they don't like. And then after all the input from the team is gathered, we turn to the decider, the decision maker in the sprint, to make the final call on what's going to go into our prototype. We capture all those decisions in a storyboard. This is sort of like the blueprint for our prototype. And we're obviously not trying to design the whole thing on the whiteboard. That would be ridiculous. But we do want to capture the big decisions so that when everybody comes in to work on their prototype on Thursday, they can just hit the ground running and crank through it. And that's exactly what happens on Thursday. Thursday's prototyping day, and it is a lot of fun. Everybody has their own job. Everybody has a different part of the prototype that they're responsible for. And we have a really tight deadline. We need to finish this prototype by the end of the day. So there's a bunch of kind of tricks that we use to get through this prototype in one day. The most important is that we're not trying to make something that's complete or even functional. What we're aiming for with our prototype is a realistic facade of the finished product. We want it to look real enough so that when customers see it, they think they're looking at the real thing. They don't think they're looking at some sort of half-baked, half-finished prototype. They think they're looking at a real product so they can react as if they were evaluating a real product. If we're working on an app or a website, a lot of times we'll use Sketch or even Keynote to make the slides, and then we'll pull those slides into a tool like Marvel or InVision and stitch them together. And so we can make apps and website prototypes really quickly that look and feel like the real thing, but don't require us to write any code. This is an example of a prototype that starts in the App Store. If you think about it, when somebody's trying your app for the first time, it doesn't just appear on their home screen, right? They have to go to the App Store and find it and read about it and consider it and then choose to install it. So a lot of our prototypes actually start in that way with the discovery. In this particular prototype, it was also really important for us to use video and audio because that was an important part of the product experience. So by building this prototype in Keynote, we were able to embed video and audio. Sometimes we're making prototypes of physical products. So this is an example from Blue Bottle Coffee, where we were prototyping different kinds of packaging that would be used to send coffee to people's homes. We can use a 3D printer like we did when we were working with a medical device company to prototype the form factor of their device. And sometimes there's no product at all. We're actually prototyping a service. We worked with one medical group to help them evaluate what it would be like to expand from offering healthcare to adults to offering it to children as well, to providing family care. So we took over one of their offices and we brought in some things that would make the waiting room a little bit more fun for kids. But most importantly, we wrote a script for how the staff and the providers would interact with the patients, the children, and their parents. And this allowed the team to figure out, before they had made the commitment to start offering family care, what it would be like and what kind of problems they would run into. Okay, so it's the end of the week. It's Friday of our sprint, and it's time for our test, customer test. We do a series of one-on-one interviews, and as you can see here, our colleague Michael is interviewing a customer, but he's not doing a lot of talking. Mostly what he's doing is having her look at the prototype that we created and encouraging her to think out loud and react to what she sees in the prototype. We do a series of 5 of these over the course of a day, and while the interviews are going on, the team is in a different room, watching the interviews over a live video feed and taking notes. And this allows us to see really quickly patterns in the prototypes. So which things are working well and which things are not working so well. But it also allows us to go back to those questions that we wrote down on Monday and start to answer them. You know, sometimes we do have a clear yes or no answer to a question, but oftentimes we have a maybe, and that helps the team identify what's the next sprint they need to do, the next test they need to run, the next thing they need to go figure out as they work through their map toward their goal. We kind of think of these customer tests as a way of traveling to the future. It's as if you get to jump in your DeLorean time machine and zoom ahead to launch day, or to the day when your new website is live, or to when your new marketing campaign launches. And to be there with your customers as they see those things for the first time and see how they react and understand if you're heading on the right path as a team. So we've done about 150 of these sprints in the last 5.5 years with all sorts of different companies. And I want to leave you now with a couple of stories. The first one is a story of a sprint we did with Slack. And I'm sure you're all familiar with Slack. It's a tool for teams to collaborate and communicate online. It's kind of like a fancy chat room, right? You know, it's obviously an amazing product, but you know, at its core, it's kind of a really fancy chat room. And when we invested in Slack at GV, the company was doing really well. They had released this chart showing some really impressive looking growth, but most of their existing customers were other tech companies. They were people who kind of already understood chat. Maybe they had used a product like Slack in the past, or they had used IRC long ago, but they kind of got it already. But Slack knew that if they wanted to expand beyond just signing up tech companies as customers, they were going to need to reach a much wider audience. And so they decided to launch a national advertising campaign. So this, if any of you have been to San Francisco, this probably looks like the sort of billboard you'd see on the 101 south of the city. But that wasn't what Slack had in mind. They wanted to put these billboards everywhere. Around the time that this launched, I was actually in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, visiting family, and saw one of these ads on the side of a bus. So they were really trying to reach people everywhere. Now I want you to imagine that you're driving this white pickup truck, or you're waiting for the bus in Milwaukee, and you see this ad and you think, wow, 48% less email. That sounds amazing, but what the hell is Slack? Never heard of this thing. So hopefully you go to slack.com, and now the website has a big job to do, because it has to not only explain to you what Slack is and convince you to use it, but it has to convince you to use it with your team. Because using Slack by yourself is not very interesting or very useful. So you kind of, you as this brand new customer who's never heard of this thing before, you kind of have to stick your neck out and tell your team, hey, come try this thing with me. I've never used it. I don't know if it's good, but come try it with me. Let's try it together. And that's tough. That's a big barrier for a lot of people. And that was the problem that we set out to solve in the sprint. The team had an existing idea, an existing solution that they thought could work to solve this problem that they brought into the sprint. And we called it Bot Team. The idea with Bot Team was that you would go to slack.com and you could sort of log into a simulation of what it would be like to use Slack with your team. Instead of your actual team members being there, you would have a team of bots that you could interact with that could kind of give you a sense of what it might be like to use Slack. The team was pretty fired up about this idea. They knew it was going to be hard to do. It was the CEO's favorite idea. That's, I think, important to mention. I think that the team's focus in the sprint was really to kind of figure out some of the details within this basic idea of kind of do the sprint to figure out how it would work. But during the sprint, we actually came up with another competing idea, something that we called the guide. And the guide is not nearly as sophisticated or as clever as the bot team. In fact, it's kind of obvious. The idea with the guide was to basically do a step-by-step tour through the Slack product. Sort of, here's where you type the message, here's where you navigate channels, here's how you search, and so on. It was going to be a lot easier to build than Bot Team. And so the team thought, we're excited about this Bot Team thing, but the guide, it just might work. There's a chance. And if it did, that would be good to know. So we converted both of these sketches into realistic prototypes. We actually gave them separate brand names. We called one Slack and we called the other one Gather. And then we decided to pit these prototypes head to head in a customer test we call a rumble. And this is something that we do in almost every sprint. It's a chance to keep competing ideas alive. Something that's very, very hard to do in typical design and product development processes. But in a sprint, you can create multiple realistic prototypes and then test all of them with customers. And that's what we did. So we brought in some customers who fit the profile. We showed them the prototypes. And we found out that Bot Team wasn't working so well. People found it confusing. This idea that the Slack team was so excited about was confusing to customers, and it seemed like it wasn't giving them a good sense of what it would actually be like to use Slack with their team. Now, you might imagine that the team at Slack was a little bit bummed that their pet idea didn't work out so well in the test, but that's not how they felt at all. In fact, they felt like they had dodged a bullet. They weren't going to waste time and money executing a solution that was unlikely to be successful. And as a silver lining, the guide actually worked really well. So this other much simpler approach tested really well with customers. And the team decided to go forward with that. So they took the design from the prototype and they put it on, they took it through their usual production design process, and they launched it on slack.com. And in fact, if you go to slack.com today and you click on product, you will see what we designed in that sprint with Slack. And the cool thing is, it totally worked. That impressive looking chart that I showed you earlier, that was actually just the beginning of Slack's growth curve. This chart is showing everything up to October 2016. So not even totally up to date, but everything after this point happened after the sprint. Now, of course, we can't attribute all of Slack's success to the sprint. There's a million other things that they have done right along the way. But it is a good example of how a sprint can help a team avoid wasting time and money on a solution that's unlikely to be successful, and sometimes come up with a surprising new solution that actually works really well with customers. All right, one more story for you before we transition into the Q&A. And this is a company that you maybe, unlike Slack, maybe you haven't heard of. The company is called Savioke. And Savioke makes the Relay robot. The Relay is a hotel delivery robot. It's about the size of a trash can. It has a little lid that opens on top, a little locker. And the way it works is that a hotel staff who has the Relay, they can put an item in this locker, like a toothbrush or a towel that a guest needs, and then they can close the lid. They can type in the hotel room number, and the Relay robot can navigate autonomously through the hotel. It has a map of the hotel loaded into its robot brain, and it can roll down the hallway. It can even ride the elevator. It can request the elevator, and it can roll on, and it can ride the elevator up, and then it makes the delivery to the guest room. It allows the staff to stay at the front desk, answering the phones, helping customers there, instead of having to run, make these deliveries. And when we met Savioke, they had already figured out all of that stuff. So they had a functional prototype, and they were just a couple weeks away from doing their first pilot program with a hotel in Cupertino, California, south of San Francisco. But they still had one really important question about the robot, which was, how should the robot behave? They knew that when they launched their pilot, there was going to be a lot of attention. They figured they were going to get press. People were going to be talking about this hotel that's got this crazy delivery robot in it, and they wanted to avoid a situation like this, where the basics of the robot were working well. They knew they were working well, but if the robot behaved in some weird way or some confusing way, it could really sour the experience for people. It could become a negative instead of a positive for the hotel and for their guests. So the team, they explained to us that people are a little bit spoiled by science fiction. If you see WALL-E or you watch Star Wars, you start to think that robots have hopes and plans and thoughts and dreams, that they're basically funny-looking humans. But the Relay robot is just not that sophisticated. Really, it just wants to deliver a toothbrush. It can't talk. It can't listen. It can't converse with you. So the safe approach for the team was to give the Relay robot no personality, just to play it straight, just focus on the basics. But still, they kind of wondered. They wondered if maybe the personality was an opportunity. It was a chance to make the robot not just useful, but also charming and delightful, to make it a reason that people would want to come back and stay at that hotel. So we did a sprint with the Savioke team to try to figure this out. They brought the robot to our office, and you can see it here shrouded under a tablecloth, as if a ghost would be less conspicuous than a robot on the Google campus of all places. But they brought it inside, and we got to meet the robot, and we immediately fell in love. Of course, had to take a selfie with the robot. And we had the whole team gathered. So we had not just the designers and the engineers, but we had their CMO, who knew a lot about hotels and what hotels valued. We had their CEO, who's joining us for the week as the decision maker. This problem was so critical to them, so important, represented such a great risk and such a great opportunity, that the CEO saw it a good use of his time to spend 5 days in the sprint with us. So we made a map on Monday of every place where a customer might encounter a robot unexpectedly. And we decided to focus on the moment of delivery, that moment when the robot pulls up to the guest room door, they open it, they make the delivery. That seemed like sort of the place where things could go really wrong or they could go really right. On Tuesday, everybody sketched their own ideas for elements of personality that we could add to the robot. And we had a bunch of different ideas. On Wednesday, we used our usual decision-making process. And at the end of it, Steve, the CEO, selected 3 risky ideas that he wanted to test in our robot prototype. The first was to have the robot play games, offer to play a game of tic-tac-toe or follow the leader with guests after the delivery was made. The second was to give the robot a face. And this might not sound particularly crazy or risky, but it was, because when you think about it, the face is the thing that implies I'm human, I'm intelligent, I can listen to you and I can converse with you. And so there was a real risk that the face would make the relay robot seem much smarter than it actually was. And the third idea was to give the robot, have the robot do a happy dance after a successful delivery. All right, so on Thursday we had 8 hours to make a prototype of our robot, and fortunately we didn't have to prototype the whole robot. We already had the basic functional robot. We just had to figure out how to add these elements of personality, these 3 risky ideas. So we divided up the work. Adrian, who is the designer for Savioke, he worked on the sound effects. This is our colleague Daniel Burka and I designing the face of the robot and sort of the way it talks and interacts. We loaded that prototype onto an iPad mini. It was just a keynote presentation. And then we stuck the iPad mini on the front of the relay robot so that people could interact with it. Tessa here, the CTO of Savioke, she worked on the robot choreography, how it would move during the test, including the happy dance. Normally, the robot is autonomous. It can operate on its own. But for the purposes of this test, Tessa was going to basically sort of Wizard of Oz. She was going to stand behind the scenes and control the robot's movement. And that was all we needed to do for the prototype. We didn't need to do all the actual programming of the robot's sensors and motors and such. Okay, so we had our prototype ready. It was the end of the week, Friday. We were ready for our test. And we had decided that in order to really have a good test, a trustworthy test, we had to test with real hotel guests. We had to test this prototype in a real hotel with real guests. So our colleague Michael flew down from Seattle to help us run the test. Here he is. And he arrived. Here he is in front of the hotel. There's a real picture of him there. He got, he's in his hotel room. He got up really early with his suitcase here. It's a real picture of his suitcase. As you can see, he's an avid traveler. He's been to many places. And inside his suitcase, he had all sorts of different gadgets. He had laptops and microphones and cameras and cables and tripods. And he even had duct tape and chewing gum so that his breath would be minty fresh for the tests with hotel guests. I don't know how he gets through airport security with all this stuff, but somehow he manages to make it through. So Michael worked with the Savioke team to rig up the hotel room into sort of a makeshift research lab so that we could see what was going on. Okay, so 9 a.m., morning of the test, 9 a.m. Friday morning. And I want you to just imagine for a second that you are one of these customers, one of these hotel guests that we're going to test with. Earlier in the week, you had been on Craigslist and you had seen a posting for usability interviews that were going to be going on. And you said, you know what, I've got some free time and I'm going to be in the area on Friday. I think I'll sign up. You get an email back from Michael saying, great, you've been accepted for the test. But there's something kind of weird in the email, which is that he tells you that the test is going to be in a hotel room. He says, I realize it's unusual to attend interviews in a hotel room. I'm like, yeah, that is pretty unusual. That is weird. But, this is Wednesday and you think, okay, maybe whatever, by Friday I'll be over it. It won't seem so weird. But then you arrive on Friday and you're in the hotel lobby and there's Michael again. And then he says, hey, come ride the elevator with me and come on into my hotel room. And then you get to the hotel room and there's cameras and microphones everywhere. And you're like, what the hell did I get myself into? But Michael's a total pro about it. He's wearing his his corporate badge, his Google badge. Obviously, he doesn't need it at the hotel, but he's wearing it to show that he is who he says he is. His posture, his body language is very conservative, very safe, and he's using a checklist to sort of keep things professional and also to keep the interview on track. So first customer comes in to see Michael and talk with Michael, and Michael's asking her questions. How often do you travel? When you arrive, what's the first thing you do? Do you unpack right away or something else? And then he says, if you had realized that you've forgotten your toothbrush, what would you do? And she says, well, I'd probably call down to the front desk. So he says, all right, go ahead, and hands her the phone. And she calls down. But it's not the front desk that answers. It's Allison from Savioke. And Allison says, yeah, no problem at all. We'll send up a toothbrush. So the interview carries on. Michael keeps asking questions. And the robot has been loaded with the toothbrush and is on his way to make the delivery. We're back at the office, and we're able to see over these cameras that Michael has set up everything that's going on. And so we're able to actually watch as the robot approaches the guest room door, and a phone call is triggered. Again, it's not really the hotel. It's Allison from Savioke calling and saying, your delivery is here. And we're able to watch as the customer sees the robot for the first time, receives the delivery, how they react. And we're able to see this 5 times during the course of the day on Friday. So we found out that nobody wanted to play games with the robot. Just wasn't interesting. But the face actually worked out really well. People found it sort of cute and charming, and nobody tried to talk to the robot. So that was a big success. And much to our surprise, the happy dance actually tested really well, and it was something that people really loved. This is an example of a feature that you probably wouldn't prioritize. You wouldn't, it wouldn't seem worth taking that risk. But in the context of a sprint, we were able to do it, and we were able to see that it actually worked really well. And so I actually have a video here of what that dance looks like. You can see here after the delivery is made, just a little twist move back and forth, which is incidentally kind of how I dance. So you can perhaps get a sense of the inspiration there. So as expected, the company did get some press when they launched, but it was good press. People focused on the personality of the robot, how friendly it was, how cute it was. And the company's doing really well. They've now got their robot deployed into a bunch of different hotel chains. And that personality that we tested during the sprint is a key part of that success. So I started this presentation telling you about the design process that I had encountered over and over in my career. And I talked about some of the things that can slow it down, some of the things that can come between us and our work as we go through this process. And it can take a long time as a result of those things. Sometimes it can take months or even years to get through this design process from beginning to end. And you probably recognize some of the things that get in the way, some of the things that keep us from our work, and also slow us down, make it harder for us to get to that critical testing stage at the end of the process. With the design sprint process, we can wipe away a lot of those things that come between us and our work. And by changing out the default steps of the design process for a new set of steps, a new set of exercises, we can get through the design process in just 5 days instead of those months or years. Doing one design sprint is valuable, but the real power comes when you can do sprint after sprint after sprint. You can get into this habit of coming up with new ideas, testing those ideas, and learning from those tests. One of the results is that you can take more risks. You know that with each test, you're only going to fail in front of 5 people. You're not going to fail in the market in front of thousands or millions of people. So you can try riskier ideas. doing these sprints also gets you closer to your customers because you're in the habit of actually watching your customers react and talking to your customers. And it brings you closer to your team. You work with your team in a different way. You learn about skills you didn't know they have. People consistently tell us at the end of the week they felt closer to their team than they ever have before. But I think for me, what's really powerful about design sprints is that they allow you to spend time on the work that really matters. So I encourage you to try a design sprint. If you're interested, pick up the Sprint book. It has everything you need to run a sprint with your team at work. At the end of the book, there's actually a 15-page checklist that has hour-by-hour instructions for exactly how to run your own sprint. So you can pick that up and you can use that as a tool on your team. And if you're interested in how these ideas, these philosophies apply, not just at work, but in life in general, I encourage you to check out Time Dorks. It's a new newsletter that I started with Jake Knapp. It's all about making good use of time. So you can find that at timedorks.com. That's all for the presentation. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer some questions now.
Great, thanks so much, John. We've got a lot of questions here actually, so we will do our best to get through them all. But
Okay.
Before we get into that, everyone, I'm going to drop the link here to the book that, of course, John and the crew over at GV wrote up, and then also this is the newsletter that John was talking about here. So let me go ahead and put that in here as well. And now let's get into questions. We've got a lot of questions, and we actually had really good attendance here today. We had around 2,000 people here live. So it's
Fantastic.
pretty packed session. But the first question we have, I think, is a really important and interesting one. Actually, before I get to that, I'm going to launch the poll here, and now let's get to the question. That question is really around the culture of a company and how to implement this process. And so when you guys started working on design sprints, was that idea something that was already embedded at GV or at least at Google, or did you need to fight it all to prove the value of that process?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when Jake created the design sprint process at Google, it was because of a problem that he had seen where a lot of ideas never really went anywhere, and then other ideas that seemed really good would launch, but then wouldn't be successful. And he saw that people really had a hunger for experimentation with process, and they liked trying different kinds of workshops. You know, there would be brainstorming sessions, and there would be hackathons, and there'd be all sorts of different things, people kind of scratching around the edges of this problem. But he felt that there was an opportunity to try to fix this problem, to try to help people test their ideas more quickly, and to sort of stop scratching around the edges and start getting to the core of the work that actually needs to be done.
Gotcha. And the next question here, actually we had a couple questions around this theme, is have you had to conduct any design sprints with remote teams? And if so, what sort of adaptations did you find were necessary?
Yeah, we have actually not done a ton of sprints with remote teams, but we have started to do them more and more. I'm going to actually redirect that question to a blog post that we wrote. That's online. I can share the link, or I'm sure you could find it just by searching for remote design sprint. It's on the GV library, so library.gv.com.
Yep.
Yeah, rather than take up any more airtime, I'll just suggest that people check out that post. It's got a bunch of advice.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's fantastic. Let's see. Yep, I found it. How to run a remote design sprint without going crazy.
Yeah.
Written by Jake Knapp. So
yep.
Go ahead and drop that in the chat here. we had a couple questions around that here. So yeah, there we go. Great. And so the next question here, and actually there were a couple questions around this, is this a framework that has to be run in 5 days, or how might you compress that if you needed to down to 3 days or even 1 day? Have you faced that sort of situation before?
Yeah, we've certainly faced a lot of, we've talked to a lot of people who would like to compress this design sprint process down. And we've experimented a lot with it. We've really tried to make it shorter. The problem is it's very, very hard to do it in less than 5 days without losing the prototyping or the test. And those are the most important parts. So some of the other activities can be compressed down a little bit. Just between me and you and the other people listening, you can do it in 4 days. It is possible to sort of squeeze in the first 3 days activities into 2 days, particularly if you've done sprints before. So if you're familiar with the process, but you have to do prototyping and you have to do the test. If you don't do those, it's not a sprint, and it's way less valuable. That said, I think that the components of the sprint, the exercises, are kind of like a Lego set that you can reuse in different ways. So we'll do this all the time. If we're working on, trying to decide the headline for an article that we're writing, we'll take 15 minutes and we'll basically do like a sketching equivalent of a sketching exercise where we'll have each individual write down their own ideas quietly, come back together and have people vote on those. You can do just the prototyping and testing on its own. You can do the prototyping and you can do a test as an online A/B experiment instead of an in-person customer interview. So you can absolutely break apart the pieces and put them back together in different ways. But the design sprint process itself, we have found in our experimentation, is very hard to trim down below 4 days without losing the most important parts.
Right. And looking back at the design sprint involvement here, we've had a couple questions about who actually gets involved in this design sprint. Obviously the designers, but beyond that, do you also invite developers, product managers, and how does that process of getting them involved and getting them bought in and willing to invest their time work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of our, we get a lot of questions about, well, how can you convince people to spend the time on this process, and how can you expect people to clear their calendars for 5 days? And we kind of look at it from a different perspective. We think that sprints should be used on problems that are so important to the company that being able to spend 5 days on it is like a gift. It's like of course we're going to spend 5 days focused on this because this is a critical issue for our company. And if we don't figure it out now, when are we going to figure it out? So we really encourage teams to find a very important problem and to use sprints to try to solve those problems. A lot of teams come at it from another perspective where they say we want to try this design sprint thing. So well, let's do it on this little, sort of not very important problem. And let's try to do it in 3 days. And we're not going to trouble the engineers because we don't want to disrupt them. So just be the designers. And then it ends up not working very well. And then, the sort of the concept of the design sprint has been sullied within that organization. And it's hard to continue to do the process. So we advocate using the process for what it was originally intended, which was to solve really big problems. To give us a somewhat more sort of logistical, detailed answer, we absolutely involve engineers, product managers, a decision maker who is sometimes the actual CEO, depending on the size of the company, sometimes just a PM or something, or a director. We'll have customer support people, we'll have marketing people, sales sometimes. And the idea is that the sprint process is for the real team. It's not for a special creative team. It's for the real team who's already working together. One of our beliefs, one of the things we've seen after working with, almost 200 companies, is that teams generally already have the knowledge and the skills that they need to do what they're trying to do. They just don't have the right way of working together. They're just, they've got all these kind of default workplace behaviors around email and meetings and things that really get in the way. And so with the sprint process, we're trying to give that existing team a good way to work. So if you're thinking about running a sprint, pick a really important problem and then make sure that the team that's involved is the real team. Make sure that it represents the actual team who is going to be trying to figure that thing out in sort of normal work life outside of the sprint anyway.
Gotcha. And the next question here, and I know this is something that I believe it was Jake who wrote about this too, about how you guys run research sprints. But the question here is really around the testing and the research around a design sprint. And given the fact that these sprints usually last 5 days,
mm-hmm.
do you guys recruit users all on your own, or do you employ an outside recruiting agency to help speed up the process?
Yeah, the unfortunate answer is that it depends, which is the answer to oh so many questions in life. I would say that our go-to process is that we do our own recruiting. And if we're recruiting from a broad base of consumers, we'll use Craigslist. So we'll post an ad that links to a screener questionnaire. The screener is critical to make sure that you're actually getting people who fit the profile of your customers. And if we're looking for somebody who's kind of a more specialized profession or some sort of a less common profile, then we'll often work with the company to try to find those people. So, for us sitting here watching this, it might seem daunting to build a prototype of a robot, or to find oncologists to test with, or to find hedge fund managers to test with, which are all real things that we've done in sprints. But if you're a robotics company, you know how to build robots. If you're an oncology company, you know some oncologists. If you're making software for hedge funds, you know hedge fund managers. At least hopefully you do. So when we can't find people on Craigslist, then we work through sort of the networks and the existing relationships that the companies have, the teams have that we're working with. I will say that recently, Michael Margolis, who's our partner here who does customer research, he has started using a service or a recruiting agency, and I can't remember the name of it. But if you tweet him, his username is mmargolis. So that's MMARGOLIS. You can ask him what he uses, and I'm sure he'll reply to you.
Gotcha. And let's see here. The next question we have is around. So the next question is really about facilitating the design sprint. So in your experience, is the person who facilitates this process generally a designer, or is there somebody, like a scrum master or a project manager who helps to drive through the activities for the week?
Again, it depends on the type of company and the type of team. At small startups who we're working with, it's often a designer or a product manager. Larger companies will often have more specialized roles. So Google even has a sprint master team, they have a training program where people can learn how to be sprint masters, and that's just what they do. It's an important question though to think about for your own team, because it's obviously the facilitator has a lot of influence over what happens in the sprint, but it's really difficult to facilitate the sprint and to contribute as an individual, doing your own sketches, things like that. So you do need to think about whether you want to, if there's a person on your team who's, say a designer who is going to be very involved in the, actual execution of the solution, you want to think about whether you want that person to be focused on facilitating the sprint, or if you want to have them, doing what they do best, which is, presumably, doing design work, coming up with ideas, that sort of thing. It can be really helpful to get somebody who's like a little bit of an outsider to facilitate a sprint, and they can just be, even like from a different team at your company, but somebody who has just enough of an outside perspective that they can ask dumb questions, and they're not already sort of bogged down by the biases that your team has. But beyond that, I would say, like, there's no magic formula for who the facilitator should be. It's somebody who is comfortable in front of a group, somebody who is excited about the process, somebody who knows the process well, and ideally somebody who isn't already intimately involved in the day-to-day of making those decisions.
Gotcha. And since we are pushing up on the hour, we'll take just one more question, and then for the rest of the discussion, we will move that over to our Slack group here. And let's see. So next question will be, so this is an interesting question about really planning around the design sprints. How far in advance do you try to plan for design sprints? Is there like a roadmap, or is there something that happens, with not a whole lot of planning months in advance?
We have deliberately designed the process itself to not require a ton of pre-planning. We want it to be something where when a team is rolling along and they run into a big problem, or they realize that they've gotten bogged down in trying to solve a problem, that they can very quickly, in a matter of just a couple of weeks, pull together a sprint and do that to try to solve that problem. I think the smartest kind of approach to this that we've seen for some of our larger companies is they basically they carve out a sprint slot, like a sprint week, once a quarter or so, or even a little bit more often than that. And they put it on the calendar, and they make sure that the room is reserved, and everybody knows it's happening. People can, hopefully plan their vacations around it and whatever else. And they don't always know, like, they don't know what this, in 3 months from now, what that sprint is going to be used for. But with a big enough company, they know that there's enough going on that there's going to be something. And since one of the hardest parts about planning a sprint is often just getting people's time, and just having all the logistical stuff of having the room and whatever. By booking that several months out in advance, you can make sure that stuff is taken care of. And then as you get a few weeks out from that sprint slot, then you do an assessment of the challenges that your company or your team is facing, and you decide what's the best use of that week.
Got it. And that is the last question that we'll actually take here.
Okay.
Let's see. So yeah, thank you so much, John, for joining us today. It was fantastic. We had a lot of people joining us, and we had almost 300 questions. So
okay, cool.
There's no way we were going to get through all of them. But we do, of course, I will link this again. We do have a Slack group here, which has over 3,500 people. And,
great.
Folks here have over 3 years of experience. I encourage them to apply here. And I can invite you as well, John, if you're curious.
Sure.
Checking it out. And of course, I will drop in the link one last time to the book, which is fantastic and offers a lot of really practical and much more detailed day-to-day breakdowns of what's involved in a design sprint. So definitely check that out if you guys want to learn more about this process, and yeah, it'll have probably the most in-depth answers that you can find. And cool. With that, oh, sorry, go ahead, John.
I was just going to say thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone for spending some of your time listening.
Yeah, and yeah, everybody here today, thanks for joining us. This is the first session throughout the week. We have the next session here coming up in about 20 minutes or so. which is going to be about design systems, and it's an in-depth case study of actually building one. So hopefully we can see you all there. Otherwise, we've got sessions throughout the week, and hope to see all the folks there. We had over 2,000 people here today, so that was fantastic. Great turnout, and I'll see all of you folks in the next few sessions. And John, thanks again for doing this. It was great.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
All right. Take care, everybody.